morning. Welcome to Inside. I'm Dave Game, and we've got a show for you this morning, especially if you're just a little bit older than I am. We're about the same age. It's something you can properly appreciate. Everyone listens to radio, but no one pays it much attention these days, it seems. There are so many stations, you can't remember the call letters. It's Power this and Zoo that, and people really don't pay the kind of attention to it that we used to pay to it in the 60s. Remember when you were growing up, the radio stations like WFUN and Tiger and all the great stations, not only here in Miami, but all over the country, the stations that played rock and roll, the stations that had the contest, the stations that you talked about with your friends the next day. Those stations have dried up, they've gone, they've disappeared, and with them a whole genre of music that they used to promote. Well, today we're going to talk about that, but first, let's get you in the mood. Let's take you back 30 years. For those of us who lived through them, there was no time like the 60s. For those of you too young to remember, the catchphrase best summing up the decade would be from A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the music which helped make it the best of times. Miami celebrated the sound of the decade when the Beatles performed here, but in truth, Miami got along just fine on the music scene, even without famous visitors. In club after club, high school after high school, garage after garage, bands grew together and burst out of the Miami scene. Homegrown sounds of the 60s, which helped define a generation. You probably have your favorite. Among the most popular band was 5 guys from South Florida who played under the name Evil. I want you to know that I love you, baby. I want you to know that I care. You know I'm so happy when you hear about me, but I'm sad when you're not there singing a song down. What you gonna do when I'm so nice? What you gonna do, crazy baby? What you gonna do about it? What you gonna do about it? If you didn't grow up here, you might never have heard that sound, but even if you missed live shows, South Florida radio was famous for picking up on local bands and pushing the music hard enough to put locals on the charts. 60s radio is nothing like the bland, computer-controlled pap of today. Just listen to Morton Downey Jr. You probably know him as a talk show host, but in the 60s, he was a disc jockey right here in Miami.
I wanted to entertain, I wanted to have fun. And so we did on my radio program. And I did little things like give out Charlie's home telephone number and tell him that was the number that the Beatles would be staying at while they were in town, or the Who, or any other, oh, I know, the Animals, that's who it was. The Animals were staying there. So we got a lot of telephone calls. I had a contest where they called them transistor sister contests in those days. You used to hide transistors around. And I gave all the directions all day long, all the clues. And they led right out to Charlie's street. And then instead of saying, and I goofed, I forgot. You know, I meant to say you turn left. I marked 6 spaces and started digging to get the radio. And I said, gee, you move right 6 spaces. And right happened to be in the middle of Charlie's front lawn. And they dug up all of his bushes, and gee, Charlie, I honest to God didn't. Sincerely, I'm saying to you, I'm sorry.
Morton Downey Jr. worked for WFUN, the radio station that in the 60s was an institution in Miami.
Climbing Sibel, little folk and soul. If you gotta go, baby, you better go now. That's a Bob Dylan song. Man for Man did it, and the crew bring it back on the Dutch Island Show on WFUN 6 minutes after 3. Boss Radio birthday brain time. WFUN weather. Partly cloudy through Saturday. Good-looking weekend forecast. A few showers mainly during the night and morning hours. Low tonight, mid-70s. High tomorrow, upper 80s. Probability of showers 30%. Currently 86 WFUN degrees downtown.
Forget all your cares.
For the Sail-a-thon. Boys find adventure, laughter, and friends at the YMCA Summer Camp. Call 374-5106. They'll send you a camp brochure.
Come alive. You're in the Pepsi generation.
This is WFUN Flight 79, non-stop music from Miami.
Boss Jocks, bop, bop, play more music, bow.
The sound dried up as the 70s moved in and FM took off. Gone were the stations which would push local bands into often brief stardom. South Florida radio put these guys on the Billboard Hot 100, but who today even remembers the clefts of Lavender Hill?
You know your baby's gonna leave you if you don't treat her better. She's gonna hop that train and say bye-bye. You gotta run and tell the conductor. You gotta stop.
And who remembers something like that? Well, Actually, we have an expert, someone who knows just about everything about the garage bands of the 60s and the 70s, right on up to the 90s. And yes, there are still some today, though the scene sort of disappeared in the 80s. You really didn't hear much about it. It's starting to come back now, sort of a homegrown cottage industry, as you've got musicians trying out their wares. And where you can learn about all this is in a book called Savage Lost. And this book was written by somebody that I've known for a long time. In fact, I've watched him go through the trials and tribulations of writing it. Jeff Lemlich is the author. Jeff happens to be a producer here at Channel 6. And you were working on this when I first came to work here in 1985, struggling through, and I've watched you almost give birth to this book. I'm glad to have you on because I'm glad to give you a chance to talk about it.
That's a good analogy because there have been so many ups and downs. I started this book actually as an article in 1977. And 14 years, it's unbelievable. But it started with a little bit of research and going into some of my archives and a lot of the old 45s that I had and researching an article, and it just kept growing and growing. And I'd talk to an old musician who would have a phone number of somebody, and they'd have somebody else's phone number, and all of a sudden what started out as 10 pages became 20 pages, 20 pages became 50, and the next thing I knew it was a book.
Well, this is the kind of thing that we all did in high school, following the bands, and I remember, I didn't grow up here in Miami, but a friend of mine had a band in upstate New York, and it made him a god. He was just loved by all the girls in school, all this status. But as we grew up, we sort of grew away from all this. You've kept track of it all these years.
I've kept track of it, and when I started this book, I wasn't keeping too good track of it because it was the disco era. It was disco and a little bit of southern rock and a few other things that were happening, but there wasn't really a lot of honesty and intensity in the music like there was in the middle 60s. And a lot of that's come back, and I'd like to talk about that later if we can.
Well, beyond nostalgia, why is this important?
This was a real important part of growing up in that era, and what I think a lot of the bands have to realize today is that the groundwork was broken by these bands back then. You had to really fight to have long hair in the 1960s. You had to fight and really take a lot of chances just to get your music heard and just for the right to play rock and roll. Rock and roll was a rebellion, and it was a very important rebellion that had to happen. And a lot of the things that transpired, which a lot of people have unfortunately forgotten about, cleared the way so that we can have a music industry like we have today, and cleared the way so that we can have bands playing at clubs.
Now, they had all sorts of different, when we say garage bands is primarily what you talk about. It's the story of Florida's garage bands. We're talking about the guys that would buy a guitar and a set of drums, 13, 14, 15 years old, get together and stars in their eyes.
That's exactly it. What would happen is they would watch Shindig or Hullabaloo on television, and it was a big deal back then. The Yardbirds are going to be on Shindig. I mean, everybody's got to watch it, and you're sitting there and you're amazed by what you're listening to. You're hearing music you've never heard before in your life. And although it was based on old blues and American rock and roll from the 50s, it was new and exciting, and we had innovations like the fuzz tone box. And it seems like every day something more exciting was happening, and kids were getting really excited about what they heard and wanted to emulate these sounds. Well, and that's what it was all about.
Weren't most of them, like, so bad? You know, looking back after the veil of nostalgia, some of the groups that played at my high school dances were just really figuratively bad.
Well, you're talking about musicianship. From the standpoint of musicianship, yes, they were really bad. But from the standpoint of rock and roll, they weren't, because rock and roll isn't about how good you can play your guitar or how good you can pound those drums. Rock and roll is about energy, it's about intensity, and it's about emotion. And when you have any kind of music that does not have those elements, it's not rock and roll. I don't care how well you play, how well you write, how well you sing. If you're not playing with that energy, it's just not really rock and roll music.
And this had a special energy, the garage band, homegrown?
Absolutely. It had energy, and it also had lots of honesty as well.
Why? What prompted these kids? Was it fame? Was it money? Did they want recording contracts?
One of the things that I point out in the book is that a lot of kids have trouble in school. You may not be able to make straight A's, you may not be able to win spelling bees, you may not be able to get on the varsity baseball team, but nearly any kid can play 3 chords on a guitar. And what an accomplishment this is when you can learn those chords and, hey, you know, I can play the new Kinks song, and I can play the new Searcher song or the new Jerry and the Pacemakers song. And you get a couple of guys together, and this one wants to be a drummer, and you've learned a couple of chords, and you're creating music. Well, on Friday night, the people who pay you no attention in school go to see your band, and all of a sudden they're up and dancing. Well, it doesn't matter if you can play well or not. What really matters is that you're up there and you're doing something and you're having a great time and people watching you are having a great time. And that was really special. And one other thing, Dave, that you have to keep in mind is back in those days, late 64, 65, 66, there weren't a lot of bands coming to town. The music industry was not the way that it is today.
Really homegrown.
So the local bands were usually asked to play covers. And if you could sound like the Kinks or sound like the Rolling Stones,
That was your ticket.
you could become a big star within your own community. And if you can write an original song that sounded like these bands,
Yeah.
you had it made.
The best I ever did was House of the Rising Sun, and that wasn't done very well. Jeff, when we come back in a second, I want to talk a little bit about why you got started with your record collection, which I understand is phenomenal, and talk a little bit more about what we've got in the book here and sort of the tracking of the bands. And we'll get more into that when Insight continues in a moment.
Today is the last day of WFUN as you remember it. Tonight at midnight, it's being taken over by new management, and it will never be the same again. Kind of sad.